By the spring of 1941, on the Marsh Road leading out to Brigantine, New Jersey, a fox terrier named Spoke ran after fiddler crabs in the evening mud and never came back. His bell rang 3 times, clear as anything, and then the sound drifted low and loose, as if the dog had dropped straight through the planks of the footbridge and kept going down into water that does not move with the tide. The reeds along the channel bent in a line, stem by stem, as though a body pushed through them at a crouch, but nothing showed above the grass. Then a single paw print appeared on the bridge rail, not on top of it, but pressed into the vertical face of the wood, wet with marsh mud beating salt water. It sat there long enough for 2 wardens to see it clearly before the moisture pulled back into the grain, and the mark faded to nothing. By midnight, the dog's leash lay in a perfect circle on the crown of the bridge, the clasp still fastened shut, the leather still warm to the touch and slick with brine. Men in New Jersey still won't tell you what that means. The footbridge crossed a narrow tidal cut just south of the main causeway, a timber and piling span maybe 40 feet long, built low over brackish water that smelled of spartina grass and engine oil from the boat slips. It connected a strip of packed shell road to a finger of higher ground where the old Brigantine dock workers kept skiffs, crab pots, and eel traps stacked in weathered rows. On one side, the Atlantic sat gray and distant beyond the dunes. On the other, the marsh spread flat and soft under a sky that never seemed to lift all the way off the ground. Salt air hung heavy most mornings, thick enough to taste, and the boards on that bridge stayed damp year-round, swollen and dark with moisture that never fully dried. In 1941, Brigantine was still a small place. Hotel money coming in from the coast, fishing families holding on to what they could, and a steady traffic of men who worked the docks and fish houses and knew the smell of low tide better than they knew the inside of a church. It was quiet work, and it kept people close. Spoke belonged to a dockman named Raymond Lyle, 42 years old, a man with a steady route and no trouble to his name. He'd had the dog for 6 years, brought him home as a pup from a litter in Atlantic City. Spoke was small, white, and tan, quick on his feet with a terrier's hard little body and a nose that never stopped working. He was known up and down the Marsh Road for the brass bell Raymond had fitted to his collar, so he could hear him in the reeds when the fog came in thick off the water. The dog went with him most mornings before dawn, rode in the bed of the truck or trotted behind when Raymond walked the line of traps and checked the pilings for rot. Raymond's wife, May, used to say the dog had more sense than half the men on the crew, and nobody disagreed with her. Spoke didn't bark at strangers. He didn't beg at the table. He stayed close and came when called. When he wasn't with Raymond, he was lying under the kitchen table or sitting on the porch, watching the road with his ears cocked forward. He didn't wander. He didn't chase gulls or bark at passing trucks. But he would chase fiddler crabs in the shallows at dusk, and that's what he was doing the evening he disappeared. Raymond had brought him down to the footbridge just after 6, the light going soft and orange over the wetland grass. It was late April, still cool enough in the evenings that most people kept their jackets on after sunset. He let Spoke off the leash on the near side of the span, the way he'd done 100 times before. The dog ran straight for the mudflat where the crabs scatter when the tide pulls back, his bell ringing clean and sharp in the stillness. Raymond stood by the truck, finishing a cigarette, watching the dog zigzag through the stubble and splash at the crabs with his front paws, tail up, head snapping left and right. Then Spoke turned and bolted toward the footbridge, head down, bell ringing fast. 3 clear notes in quick succession. Raymond called once, not loud, just the dog's name. Spoke didn't stop. He hit the boards at a full run, and the bell rang 3 more times as he crossed the first third of the span. Then the sound dropped. Not faded, but dropped, sudden and low, as if the dog had gone under the bridge instead of over it. The bell kept ringing for maybe 5 seconds, muffled, drifting, directionless, like it was coming from inside the water itself. Then it stopped. Raymond walked onto the bridge, still calling. There was no dog. The far end was empty. The water below showed nothing but slow ripples and a few strands of eelgrass turning in the current. He walked the span twice, checked both banks, leaned over the rail and scanned the mud and the grass line. He called until his voice went hoarse. The reeds along the channel bent in a neat line from north to south, one stem after another, like something had shoved through them low to the ground, but there was no shape, no movement, no sound. Raymond stood at the edge and stared into the grass for a long time. Then he climbed down under the bridge and waded in up to his knees, dragging his hands through the cold water. Nothing. The mud was smooth. No prints, no bells, no body. By the time he climbed back onto the road, 2 wardens from the coastal patrol had pulled up in their truck. One of them had heard Raymond shouting from a quarter-mile down the shore track. They brought flashlights and walked the bridge again, all 3 of them, checking every board, every gap, every joint in the pilings. The wood was old but solid. No rot, no breaks, no place a small dog could slip through. That's when one of the wardens stopped and pointed at the south rail without saying a word. There was a paw print pressed into the vertical face of the timber, small and clear, wet with dark mud, about 3 feet off the deck. It sat there like someone had taken the dog's paw and stamped it onto the wood as if the rail were lying flat on the ground. The mud was still damp. Moisture beaded along the pads and claws, trembling in the offshore wind. The 3 men stood there and stared at it. None of them touched it. Raymond said later that it looked like Spoke had tried to climb the rail from the outside, like he'd been running along the side of the bridge in open air, his paw hitting the wood in mid-stride. Then the water pulled back into the grain, slow and even, and the print faded line by line until there was nothing but clean timber again. The wardens tied strips of white cloth to the pilings at both ends and set 2 men on the bridge with lanterns after dark. Their lights swung low and even, huffing like lungs in the salt wind, and the men did not speak much. At midnight, one of them walked the crown of the span to change position, boots heavy on the warped boards, and his foot knocked something solid in the dark. He bent down and found the leash. It was laid out in a perfect circle. No kinks, no twists. The brass clasp still fastened shut as if the collar were still inside it. He picked it up barehanded and called the other man over. The leather was warm, not sun-warm, but body-warm, slick with brine that had not been there when Raymond lost the dog 6 hours earlier, and it smelled like Spoke. Both men stood there with the leash between them in the yellow lantern glow, and neither one wanted to hold it long. One of them wrapped it in a piece of cloth and put it in the back of the patrol truck. The next morning, Raymond came back with 12 men from the docks and the fish houses. They walked the marsh in a line, shoulder to shoulder, poking the reeds with oar handles and dragging gaffs through the shallows where the water was too dark to see through. Dogs were brought in from 2 different families, but they wouldn't cross the bridge. They sat down hard on the shell road and whined, ears flat, tails tucked, and no amount of pulling or coaxing would move them past the first piling. A bait pail that had been sitting on the north end of the bridge for 2 days, rusted tin, half full of sand and rotted eel, had shifted 6 inches toward the center of the span. There was no wind that morning. The pail had scraped a clear line through the grit on the boards, moving straight and deliberate, against the grain of the wood. One of the wardens crouched next to it and touched the metal. It was still cold. Gulls that usually mobbed the pilings for scraps circled the bridge twice and veered off hard to the west. They would not land. By afternoon, children playing near the shell road 100 yards from the bridge told their mothers they could hear claws ticking on dry wood, quick and light, like a small dog walking underneath their feet, even though they were standing on solid ground. The mothers pulled them back toward the houses and did not let them near the cut again. That evening, the warden strung a chain across the bridge approach and posted a man at each end after dark. The official reason given to the few people who asked was structural inspection pending. Nobody pressed for details. Nobody complained about the half-mile detour down the coast road. Old hands around Brigantine, New Jersey still tell the younger ones, you don't walk that stretch alone between dusk and dawn. Not then. Not now. And if you hear a bell ringing under the planks when there's no dog above them, you walk the other way and you don't look back. The timeline made no sense from the start. Raymond had let the dog off the leash at 6:14 in the evening. He checked his watch when he lit the cigarette. By 6:20, Spoke was gone, but a woman named Iris Cobb, who lived in the last house before the Marsh road turned to shell, told the wardens she heard a dog bell ringing under her porch at 6:40, a full 20 minutes after the dog disappeared. She was sitting in her kitchen with the window open, and the sound came from directly below her, rhythmic and insistent like a dog scratching to get out. She went outside with a broom handle and looked under the boards. There was nothing there. The ground was dry and undisturbed. It stopped the second I bent down, she said, like it knew I was looking. At 7:10, a fisherman named Caleb Byers was tying off his skiff on the far side of the cut, maybe 60 yards downstream from the Footbridge, when he heard 3 sharp bell notes coming from the direction of the span. He looked up and saw Raymond standing alone on the bridge. No dog, no movement. Caleb called over to ask if Raymond had lost something. Raymond didn't answer. Later, when the Wardens asked Caleb what time he heard the bell, he was certain. 7:10, he said. I'd just checked my watch because I was late getting the boat in. By that time, Raymond had already been searching for nearly an hour, and the dog's leash was already lying in a circle on the bridge crown, though no one had found it yet. The third sighting came from a boy named Peter Rule, 11 years old, who was walking home along the dune line just after sunset. He told his father he saw a small white dog running parallel to the Marsh road, inside the reed line, moving fast and low to the ground. The dog's bell was ringing, but the sound was wrong, muffled, as if the dog were running with its head underwater. Peter said he stopped and watched for maybe 10 seconds following the line of moving reeds, and then the reeds stopped moving and the sound cut off. He ran the rest of the way home and didn't tell anyone until the next morning when his father heard about the search. The Wardens walked Peter back to the spot where he said he saw the reeds move. There were no paw prints. The mud was smooth and packed, and the grass showed no sign of disturbance. He was there, Peter said. I saw the reeds bend. His father believed him. Most people in Brigantine, New Jersey believed him too, and that made it worse. The search went on for 3 days, organized and methodical. Raymond and the dock crew walked the marsh in a grid, marking each section with cloth strips tied to stakes driven into the soft ground. They dragged hooks through the water on both sides of the bridge, pulled up nothing but eel grass and crab shells. A boat was brought in to sweep the channel downstream, 2 men with poles working the bottom while a third manned the oars. The water was shallow, no more than 5 feet at high tide, and the bottom was visible in most places. They found an old anchor, a coil of tarred rope, and a rusted fish trap, but no dog. The Wardens brought in 2 more dogs from the Atlantic City side, both trained for tracking. The first one made it halfway across the bridge before it sat down hard and refused to move. The second wouldn't even approach the span. It pulled so hard against the lead that the handler had to carry it back to the truck. On the second day, one of the dock workers noticed that the white cloth strips they'd tied to the bridge pilings the night before were gone. All 4 of them. The wood showed no sign they'd ever been there. No frayed threads, no knot marks, nothing. The crew tied new strips in the same places, this time using wire to bind them tight. By the next morning, 2 of the 4 were missing again, and a 5th strip had appeared on a piling they hadn't marked, tied in a neat bowline knot that none of the men recognized as their own. Who the hell tied that one? One of them asked. Nobody answered. They left it where it was. Strange details kept surfacing. A man named Otto Fisk, who ran a bait shop near the coast road, said he found a small brass bell in the bed of his truck on the morning of the second day. It looked like the one Raymond had on Spoke's collar. Same size, same dull finish, same iron clapper inside. Otto brought it to Raymond, who looked at it for a long time and then said it wasn't the same bell. The one on Spoke's collar had a dent on the left side where the dog had knocked it against a piling 2 years earlier. This bell was clean. Raymond handed it back and walked away. Otto kept the bell in a drawer at the shop for 3 weeks, and then one morning it was gone. The drawer was still locked. He never mentioned it again. On the 3rd day, the search party was working the south bank when one of the younger men, a dockhand named Luis Ortiz, stopped and held up his hand. "You smell that?" he said. The others stopped. There was a faint odor in the air, sharp and metallic like hot iron or spent shell casings. It was coming from a spot near the bridge approach where the grass grew thick and the ground stayed wet. They searched the area on their knees, pulling back the reeds, digging with their hands. There was no fire, no metal, no source for the smell. It faded after a few minutes and didn't come back. Luis said later that it reminded him of the smell that lingers in the air after you brand cattle, that mix of burned hide and scorched iron. but there were no cattle within 2 miles of the marsh, and no one had lit a fire anywhere near the cut. The older hands started talking among themselves that afternoon, low voices under the sound of the wind. One of them, a man named Dutch Voorhees who'd worked the dock since before the war, pulled Raymond aside and told him something Raymond didn't repeat to anyone for years. "My father used to say there's a seam in the ground out past the bridge," Dutch said. "A soft place. Things that go in don't always come back the same way they went in, and sometimes they come back wrong." Raymond asked what he meant by wrong. Dutch didn't answer directly. He just said, "If you hear that bell again, don't follow it." The older hands in New Jersey told the younger ones the same thing that week, and it became a rule that didn't need explaining. You don't go looking for sounds that shouldn't be there, and you don't go near the cut alone after dark. On the evening of the third day, May Lyle came down to the bridge with a pot of coffee and a basket of bread for the search crew. She stood on the north end of the span and called Raymond over. She didn't step onto the boards. "I want you to come home," she said. "He's gone, Ray. You're not going to find him." Raymond looked at her for a long time and then nodded. The crew packed up their tools and their cloth markers and walked back to the road in a loose line, nobody talking. The Wardens kept 2 men posted at the bridge for another week, but the active search was over. That night, just after midnight, both Wardens on duty heard a sound coming from under the bridge. It was rhythmic, deliberate, a soft ticking, like claws on dry wood, moving from south to north beneath the span. One of them leaned over the rail with his lantern and shone the light down into the space between the pilings. There was nothing there. The sound continued for maybe 30 seconds and then stopped. The 2 men looked at each other and did not speak. One of them wrote in the patrol log, "Unidentified sound, no visual, 12:14 a.m. The next night the sound came again, same time, same duration. The Wardens requested permission to close the bridge entirely. Permission was granted without question. By the end of the week the chain was replaced with a wooden barricade and a sign was posted. Bridge closed, no crossing. The detour added 20 minutes to the route for anyone heading to the East Docks, but no one in Brigantine, New Jersey asked the Wardens to reopen it. Not that month. Not that year. And when the children asked why the bridge was closed, their parents told them it was rotten wood, unsafe to walk on, and left it at that. The bridge stayed closed, but the search didn't end. It turned into something else, slower, quieter, more like a vigil than a hunt. Raymond went out every morning for 2 weeks, walking the marsh alone before dawn, calling the dog's name into the gray light. He carried a burlap sack with a blanket inside, in case Spoke was hurt and hiding. May stopped asking him to stay home. She just made sure he ate before he left and that the truck had enough fuel. The other dock workers gave him space but kept an eye on the Marsh Road in case he didn't come back on time. Nobody said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same thing. If the dog could vanish on a 40-foot bridge in full view, what could happen to a man walking alone in the reeds at dawn? By the second week, the search had become a community routine. Women from the church brought food to the Lyle house every other day. The Wardens kept a patrol log and walked the bridge perimeter twice a day, noting anything out of place. The dock crews checked in with each other more often than they used to, and nobody worked the South Bank alone anymore. It wasn't an official rule. It didn't need to be. People in Brigantine, New Jersey, had learned something without saying it clearly. The marsh had changed, or their understanding of it had, and either way the old habits didn't feel safe anymore. On the 9th day after Spoke disappeared, Raymond found something that stopped him cold. He was walking the east side of the cut near a stand of cattails about 30 yards downstream from the bridge when he saw a piece of leather sticking out of the mud. He bent down and pulled it free. It was a dog leash, brown leather, brass fittings, the clasp still fastened shut. It looked exactly like the one the Wardens had found on the bridge the first night, the one they'd wrapped in cloth and put in the patrol truck. Raymond turned it over in his hands. The leather was dry and stiff, caked with dried mud, but when he wiped it clean with his thumb, he could see the tooled pattern along the edge. It was his leash. He was sure of it. He'd bought it in Atlantic City 6 years earlier, and the pattern was distinctive, a row of small diamonds stamped into the leather near the buckle. He walked straight to the Warden station, and asked to see the leash they'd found on the bridge. The duty warden, a man named Howell, brought it out from the back room, still wrapped in the same cloth. Raymond unwrapped it and laid both leashes side by side on the desk. They were identical. Same length, same brass fittings, same diamond pattern along the edge. Howell stared at them for a long time. "Where'd you find the second one?" he asked. Raymond told him. Howell picked up the leash from the marsh and turned it over slowly. "This one's been in the ground," he said. "Looks like it's been there a while." Raymond nodded. "But it hasn't," he said. "That's my leash. I've only ever had one." Howell didn't argue. He wrapped both leashes separately and put them in a wooden box in the back room. "Don't touch them barehanded anymore," he said. Raymond asked why. Howell just shook his head. "I don't know. But if there's two of the same thing and there shouldn't be, that means something's wrong in a way I don't have words for." Raymond left without the leashes. He didn't ask for them back. That night, Howell checked the box before he locked up. Both leashes were still there, wrapped tight. The next morning, he checked again. One of them was gone. The cloth was still folded in the box, empty, as if the leash had been pulled out through the fabric without unwrapping it. Howell told the other wardens, and they searched the entire station. They never found it. People started talking in careful ways, voices low, words chosen slowly. Some said Raymond had enemies, a man he'd fired 2 years back, a dispute over a boat slip that never got resolved. Others said the dog had gotten into something poisonous in the marsh and crawled off to die where no one would find him, and the rest was just coincidence and nerves. A few, mostly the older dock workers, said the land out past the thorn fence line never gives back what it takes, and if you go looking too hard, it takes more. Nobody used the word that sat in the center of every conversation. Nobody said ghost or haunted or unnatural. But the weight of it was there, heavy and unspoken, in the way people looked at the bridge and then looked away. Raymond stopped going out to the marsh after the second leash appeared. He told May he was done searching, that it didn't make sense anymore, that he was chasing something he didn't understand. She asked him what he thought happened. He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I think Spoke ran onto that bridge and went somewhere else. Not downstream, not into the water, somewhere else." May didn't ask him to explain. She just nodded and poured him more coffee. The stories kept coming in, small and strange, each one adding another layer of unease. A boy fishing off the south bank said he saw a white shape moving through the reeds at dusk, low and quick, but when he called out, the shape stopped and didn't move again. A woman hanging laundry near the coast road said she heard a bell ringing from the direction of the bridge 3 afternoons in a row, always at the same time, always stopping after 3 or 4 rings. 2 men working on a skiff near the cut said they found small paw prints in the wet sand one morning, leading from the water's edge to the base of the bridge and then stopping, as if the dog had walked out of the channel and vanished mid-stride. The prints were fresh. They were gone by noon. On the 16th day, a priest from the parish in town came down to the bridge at Raymond's request. His name was Father Carmody, an older man with a steady voice and no taste for drama. Raymond had asked him to bless the bridge, or the water, or whatever it was that needed blessing. Father Carmody agreed without asking too many questions. He stood on the north end of the span with a small vial of holy water and said a prayer for the dead and the lost. When he finished, he walked to the center of the bridge and poured the water onto the boards. It beaded and rolled, pooling in the cracks between the planks, and then it drained through. Father Carmody stood there for a moment, looking down at the water below. Then he stepped back and walked off the bridge without saying anything. Raymond followed him to his car. "Did it help?" Raymond asked. Father Carmody put his hand on Raymond's shoulder. "I don't know," he said, "but I'll tell you this, I've blessed a lot of places in my life, and I've never felt one push back before." Raymond asked what he meant. Father Carmody got in his car. "Don't go out there alone," he said. "Not at night. Not ever." After that, people in Brigantine stopped asking when the bridge would reopen. The barricade stayed up. The detour became permanent. Parents told their children not to play near the cut, and the children obeyed without asking why. The dock workers developed a new habit. If you were working the South Bank and the light started to fade, you packed up early and headed back before full dark. If you heard a bell ringing in the marsh, you didn't investigate. If you saw reeds moving in a line with no wind, you turned around and walked the other way. These weren't rules anyone wrote down. They were just things people did, learned through a quiet and collective instinct for survival. Raymond kept the first leash, the one the Wardens had let him take back before the second one appeared, in a wooden box in his garage. He didn't look at it often. May said she could hear him out there some nights, not doing anything, just sitting on the workbench with the box in front of him. One night in early summer, 3 months after Spoke disappeared, Raymond opened the box to check if the leash was still there. It was. But it was warm. Not hot, just warm, like it had been lying in the sun or hanging on a body. The garage was cold. Raymond touched it once, pulled his hand back and closed the box. He didn't open it again. The next morning, May found him sitting on the front steps, staring at the Marsh Road. "I'm not going back out there," he said. May sat down next to him. "Good," she said. They didn't talk about it after that. The summer of 1941 passed, and the bridge stayed closed. By autumn, the wooden barricade had weathered to gray, and the chain across the approach had rusted tight to the posts. The footbridge itself began to sag in the middle, the boards warping under the weight of salt air and neglect. Nobody proposed repairs. The detour became the main route, and within a year, most of the newer families in Brigantine didn't even know the old bridge had ever been open. But the older families knew. They remembered Raymond Lyle walking the marsh every morning with his dog. And they remembered the spring when the dog didn't come back. And they remembered the leash that appeared in 2 places at once. They didn't talk about it with outsiders, but among themselves, in low voices over coffee or while mending nets on the docks, the story stayed alive. Raymond and May moved away in the fall of 1943, 2 years after Spoke disappeared. They didn't say where they were going, and they didn't sell the house, just locked it up and left the key with May's sister. People said Raymond couldn't stand being near the marsh anymore, that he heard the bell in his sleep and woke up looking for the dog. May told one of the churchwomen that Raymond had started seeing things at dusk. A white shape moving through the reeds, always at the edge of his vision, always gone when he turned to look. "He's not crazy," May said. "He just can't stay here." The house stayed empty for 5 years. When May's sister finally sold it in 1948, the new owners found the wooden box in the garage. Inside was a dog leash, coiled neat, the leather cracked and stiff. They threw it in the trash. A week later, it was back in the box. They threw it out again. It came back again. The third time, they left it where it was and didn't open the box anymore. By 1950, the footbridge had collapsed on the south end. The pilings rotted through and the boards half submerged in the tidal mud. The county sent a crew to dismantle what was left, but after 2 days of work, the foreman called it off. He told the county supervisor that his men refused to go back. "They said the place felt wrong," the foreman reported. "Tools going missing. Sounds under the boards when nobody's there. One guy said he heard a dog bell ringing right next to his ear, loud as anything, and when he turned around there was nothing." The county marked the site as a hazard and moved on. The remains of the bridge stayed where they were, half sunk and forgotten, slowly disappearing into the marsh. But the rules that grew up around the bridge didn't disappear. They spread and hardened into something closer to law. Parents in Brigantine taught their children not to walk the old Marsh Road after dark. And when the children asked why, the parents said the ground was soft and the footing was bad. But the real reason sat behind their eyes, unspoken. Dock workers who came in from other towns were told in their first week, "If you're working the South Bank and you hear a bell ringing in the reeds, you don't go looking. If you see a white shape moving low through the grass, you turn around and head back to the road." These weren't suggestions. They were conditions of employment. Men who laughed at the warnings didn't last long. Not because they were fired, but because something would happen. A tool would go missing, a skiff would drift loose, a sound would come from the wrong direction at the wrong time, and they'd leave on their own. The stories kept accumulating, slow and steady, each generation adding its own. In 1955, a boy named Michael Court was playing near the old bridge site with 2 friends when he found a brass bell half buried in the mud. It was small, dull, with an iron clapper inside. He brought it home and put it on his bedside table. That night, he woke to the sound of the bell ringing. It was sitting on the table, perfectly still, but the ringing was coming from inside it, soft and rhythmic. He threw it out the window. His mother found it on his pillow the next morning. She took it to the church and left it in the donation box. Father Carmody, still at the parish 15 years after blessing the bridge, took the bell out of the box and held it for a moment. Then he wrapped it in cloth, put it in a metal tin, and buried it in the cemetery behind the church. "Some things don't want to stay lost," he told Michael's mother, "and some things shouldn't be found." In 1961, the county built a new access road that bypassed the old Marsh route entirely. The shell road fell into disuse, and the collapsed bridge disappeared completely under 20 years of sediment and Spartina grass. But people in New Jersey still knew where it had been. Fishermen avoided anchoring near the old cut. Hunters walked their dogs on long leads and didn't let them run loose in the reeds south of the coast road. When teenagers dared each other to walk the old route at night, they rarely made it past the halfway point before turning back. They'd come home pale and quiet, and when their friends asked what happened, they'd say they heard something, or saw something, or felt something that made them understand very suddenly that they were not welcome there. The Lyle house changed hands 3 more times over the decades. Every family that lived there found the wooden box in the garage eventually, and every family found the leash inside it. Most of them left it alone. One family, in the early 1970s, tried to burn it. They built a fire in the yard and threw the leash into the flames. It wouldn't catch. The leather blackened and curled, but it didn't burn. They pulled it out with a stick and threw it in the trash. A week later, their youngest daughter, 8 years old, came into the kitchen holding the leash. "I found this under my bed," she said. Her mother went white. They moved out 3 months later. The leash stayed in the garage. By the 1980s, the story of Spoke and the Footbridge had become local lore, the kind of thing people mentioned when they wanted to explain why certain roads didn't get used, why certain stretches of marsh stayed empty even during busy fishing seasons. Newcomers to Brigantine heard the story in pieces: a comment at the bait shop, a warning from a neighbor, a question about why the kids didn't play near the old shell road. Most of them dismissed it as small-town superstition, but after a few months, they'd noticed that the locals meant it. They didn't cross certain lines, they didn't go certain places after dark. And when a dog went missing near the marsh, they didn't organize a search party for the South Bank. They looked everywhere else first. In 1995, a documentary crew from a regional television station came to Brigantine to film a piece on coastal history. They interviewed a few of the older residents, including a man named James Howell, the son of the warden who had handled the case in 1941. James brought out the patrol log from that spring, yellowed and brittle, the entries written in his father's tight, careful handwriting. The crew filmed the pages, descriptions of the search, notes on weather and tide, a drawing of the paw print on the bridge rail. On the last page, dated May 3, 1941, there was a single line written in pencil at the bottom. "Something here we do not understand. Recommend permanent closure." The crew asked James if he believed the story. He looked at them for a long time. "My father wasn't a superstitious man," he said, "but he never went near that cut again, not for the rest of his life, and he told me not to either. So no, I don't go there, and I don't let my grandkids go there. That's not superstition, that's respect." The leash still exists. It's still in the garage of the house Raymond Lyle built in 1935, now owned by a family who doesn't know the full story and doesn't ask too many questions. Every few years, someone new finds the box, opens it, and sees the leash inside. Most of them leave it alone. A few have tried to get rid of it. None of them have succeeded. The leather is cracked and stiff now, nearly 80 years old, but on certain nights, humid summer evenings when the wind comes in off the marsh and the air tastes like salt and old wood, the leash is warm to the touch. Not hot, just warm. Like it's been hanging on a dog that's still out there running through the reeds, bell ringing, faint and directionless, looking for a way back to a world it left in the spring of 1941. People in New Jersey still tell the story. They tell it to their children, and their children tell it to theirs. and the details stay consistent across generations because the fear that holds it together has never faded. They say a dockman's dog ran onto a timber bridge at dusk and disappeared between one step and the next. They say the leash appeared in two places at once, warm and impossible. They say the reeds bent as if something passed through them, but nothing ever showed above the grass. And they say that if you go down to the marsh south of Brigantine on a still evening and listen carefully, you might hear a bell ringing under the ground, faint and steady, as if the dog is still running, still chasing something, still trying to come home. 3 versions of this story circulate depending on who's telling it. The first says Raymond had enemies, that someone took the dog to hurt him, that the strangeness was coincidence, and the fear was just small-town paranoia. The second says the dog drowned in the cut or got caught in the pilings, that the body washed out to sea, that the sounds and the sightings were grief playing tricks on people who wanted to believe in something bigger than loss. The third version, the one nobody says out loud but everybody knows, says the dog went somewhere else. Not into the water, not into the reeds, but through them, into a seam in the world that opened for just a moment on a timber bridge in the spring of 1941. And that seam has never fully closed. Which version makes sense here? The human one, the natural one, or the impossible one nobody in New Jersey dares to say out loud? And if the leash keeps coming back, warm and real, after 80 years of trying to throw it away, what does that mean about the dog it belonged to and the place it disappeared and the line between the world we see and the world we pretend isn't there? Subscribe so you don't miss the next story.